Firstly, thank you very much for viewing. I'm Stephann Makri from University College London Interaction Centre, and this talk is on research I've been carrying out as part of an interdisciplinary project called SerenA that aims to gain a rich understanding of how researchers come across information serendipitously and how we can design digital information resources based on this understanding. So what is serendipity anyway? Well, there's no single agreed definition, but the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. And it highlights that the word was originally coined after a fairy tale, The Three Princes of Serendip, where the princes were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of. We felt that existing definitions didn't really capture the essence of serendipity, and we wanted to understand it better so that we could design digital information resources based on that understanding. There are existing systems that aim to facilitate serendipitous connections, but little thought seems to have been put into how these systems will be useful to users. This system, called serendipity, suggests a route that someone might walk through a city such as New York on, and gives them often bizarre instructions to carry out. Head southeast towards 14th Street Loop and then look for someone who seems lonely and ask to walk with them for a while. This is situationist. According to the developer's own website, it alerts members to each other's proximity and gets them to interact in random situations which vary from the friendly, hug me for 5 seconds exactly, or compliment me on my haircut, to the subversive, e.g. help me rouse everyone around us into revolutionary fervour and storm the nearest TV station. We need a better understanding of serendipity to create systems that serve a useful purpose. To get this better understanding, we conducted semi-structured critical incident interviews with 28 academic researchers from a variety of disciplines, and we asked them to discuss in detail memorable examples of coming across information serendipitously, either as part of their research or in everyday life. We found similarities in the examples provided by our interviewees, and we were able to come up with a broad description of the process of serendipity. This process involves making a new connection between an informational or non-informational need and a thing, such as a person, event, place, information, object, with the potential to address that need. The circumstances that led to the connection being made must be considered to be, to some extent, unexpected. The making of the connection itself must be considered to have involved an amount of insight. Forward-facing projections are then made on the potential value of the outcome, and actions are then taken to exploit the connection. These actions lead to a valuable outcome which addresses the need, but was not anticipated as a way of addressing it. Although already considered valuable to some degree, the full extent of the value of the outcome becomes apparent over time through an iterative process of projecting further value to be gained from the connection, continuing to exploit the connection, and reflecting on the value of the outcome. Then, after reflecting on the role of unexpectedness and insight involved in the experience, it can be considered as serendipity. Let's illustrate this process with an example. An urban design researcher was thinking about how to design a joint university faculty building for sustainability and architecture. The aim of the building design was to try to bring together researchers from the two related disciplines. The interviewee wanted to design the movement within the building to provide many different paths between rooms, so that in her words, you had to walk past a series of exhibitions and possible inspirations on your way to your office every single day. While sitting in the studio, and after a long day of thinking about how to design the building, the interviewee was watching the US news-based comedy program, The Daily Show. She frequently watched this particular show, where the host makes fun of the news and talks to a guest towards the end of the show. In this particular show, the guest was a geologist who had found the wreckage of the RMS Titanic. When asked about his most significant rather than best-known finding, the geologist described finding large ecosystems at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, where giant tube worms had a symbiotic relationship with creatures that would capture the sulfur that had escaped from the Earth's crust and would live inside the tube worms. The interviewee found this particularly inspiring and translated the concept of the tube worm's symbiotic relationship with the creatures into a metaphor to guide her building design. She used this metaphor to design the building based on a symbiotic, sustainable concept where spaces within the building live off each other, where, if you had taken something and cut it off, you were cutting off some of the life source. Described in terms of our model, the interviewee made a mental connection between a need to design the joint university faculty building to bring together researchers from the two different departments, and the information she came across about the symbiotic relationships between the tube worm and the creatures that lived inside them. There was an amount of unexpectedness involved in the circumstances that led to the connection being made, as the Daily Show does not regularly include factual content. It's a comedy show first and foremost. The host asking the geologist on the show about his most important finding, rather than about discovering the wreckage of the Titanic, might also be considered to be somewhat unexpected. The interviewee also explained that she only went to the studio that evening to pick something up. There was also an amount of insight involved in making the connection, in identifying the symbiotic relationship as a potential design metaphor for the joint faculty building. The interviewee made a projection that the notion of symbiotic relationships might be useful for designing the building, and took action to exploit the connection by sketching several ideas for symbiotic building designs. She pulled over several times whilst driving home to make these sketches. She also discussed symbiotic relationships with one of her friends who had an architectural background. She continued to exploit the connection by actually designing the building based on the symbiotic relationship metaphor. The connection made by the interviewee resulted in a valuable, unanticipated outcome. The outcome was unanticipated, as even though the interviewer was hoping to think of a way to design the building to bring people together, she had not previously considered adopting symbiotic relationships as a design metaphor. The outcome was particularly valuable to the interviewee. She commented, "I would have never found the passion to do the project that I did had I not stumbled upon that." Afterwards, the interviewee reflected on coming across the tube worm information and said to herself, "Wow, what a coincidence that this happened today." We can also take the three common elements from the process of serendipity: unexpectedness, insight, and value, and use them as the basis of a framework for classifying potentially serendipitous experiences, to help us decide whether or not an experience is considered to be serendipitous, and if so, just how serendipitous. For each potentially serendipitous experience, we can ask ourselves, how unexpected were the circumstances that led to the connection being made? How insightful was the making of the connection itself? And how valuable was the outcome? If the answer to any of these questions is not at all, we would not consider the example to be serendipitous. We suggest that the tube worm example was very unexpected, insightful, and valuable. The answers to these questions are subjective, and they can also vary across different individuals involved. Based on the amounts of unexpectedness, insight, and value perceived to be involved in the experience, some experiences can be considered more serendipitous than others. For example, those which are considered to be very unexpected, insightful, and valuable, the row below the header row in the table, labelled as pure serendipity, can be considered to be more serendipitous than those which are considered only somewhat unexpected, insightful, and valuable, the bottom row, labelled as dilute serendipity. There are also two possible mid-strength mixes. The big question is, how can we use our findings, and particularly the concepts of unexpectedness, insight, and value, to inform the design of digital information resources? I think that the notion of designing to encourage serendipity is an oxymoron, because as soon as you engineer it into a system, the result may not be considered by users to be serendipitous. Consider a system that recommends interesting and surprising people to meet, or books to read. This might take some or all of the unexpectedness and insight out of making a serendipitous connection. Some people might perceive suggestions that lead to a valuable outcome to be serendipitous, others might not. One of our interviewees asked herself, "Can you engineer serendipity? Surely that's a contradiction in terms. So then how do you design for it?" One possible answer is to shift focus away from trying to facilitate serendipity and towards trying to create connections that people might not otherwise have had. So why is Google interested in ending serendipity by creating it? Possibly because they realise that there's more to information acquisition than search. We are now seeing a shift in digital information environments from active search to passive acquisition, from pull to push. This is a shift from information search to information discovery. One existing information resource that helps us to discover information is StumbleUpon, which asks users for their interests, so I've told it travel, and then takes them to a random website that's been categorized by other users as related to that interest. For example, I was shown a website for choosing the best seats on flights. Trapit does something similar, asking users for their interests and continuously scouring the web for information based on those interests. But there's still further potential for designing digital information resources that promote information discovery. Traditional search engines such as Google might use the history of searches that a user has submitted and the sites they've clicked on to infer their general interests and then make suggestions for sites that might interest them but were not directly related to the current search. Usually search engines try to return results that are as relevant and specific as possible to the search query entered, but an engine that promotes information discovery might provide results that are not highly relevant or specific to the current query, but are still considered as interesting. In social media, imagine Twitter suggesting people or organizations to follow based on connections with those that they already follow. The aim should be to make suggestions that users might perceive as serendipitous rather than obvious ones. For example, someone who follows several Hollywood celebrities might also want to follow UK royalty, or someone who follows a particular research group might also want to follow organisations who have ties to that research. Imagine LinkedIn looking at the employment history of a user who's looking to change careers but isn't exactly sure which career to choose, and making suggestions for contacts in new areas that the user might not have thought of otherwise. Imagine Facebook prioritising the feeds it presents to users by monitoring the type of posts a user comments on. A user who comments more on wedding and baby photos might also be particularly interested in seeing posts about other special occasions, such as graduations. With digital libraries, the aim should not be simply to provide users with recommendations of similar pages, as shown here. We're not talking about obvious suggestions such as papers with shared keywords or metadata. Perhaps suggestions might be made for papers from a different discipline but with several shared citations, papers on a different topic but adopting a similar methodology, or papers on similar topics from journals that the user has never accessed before. In all these application areas, there's likely to be a sweet spot of suggestions, which are neither so broad that users do not consider them to be valuable, nor so narrow that the users may have already considered them. So although we cannot engineer serendipity into digital information resources, we can facilitate connections that users might perceive as serendipitous, or at the very least as valuable. Therefore, this research can help designers of digital information environments think about how their environments can support users in making and exploiting connections in order to maximise the possibility of a valuable outcome. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment. I particularly like to read your examples of serendipity. Tell me what exactly happened, and how was your experience unexpected, insightful and valuable? Thanks again.